The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as I sat by the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows across the meadow that had been my family's refuge for decades. My name is Daniel Whitaker, and at 38, I'd carved out a modest life managing a small construction business in the city. But this plus Whitaker's Meadow, a sprawling 80-acre parcel in the rolling hills of Crestview, is my sanctuary. My great-uncle, Amos Whitaker, had bought it in the 1950s, a reward for years of backbreaking work as a railroad engineer. He'd turned down countless offers from developers, determined to keep this land untouched, a haven for our family. Every summer, he'd bring me here as a kid, teaching me how to track deer through the woods, how to read the stars, and how to listen to the land. "This is our blood, Daniel," he'd say, his voice rough but warm. "No one can take it from us unless we let them." That night, I'd driven up from the city after a brutal week, craving the quiet of the meadow. I'd pitched my tent near the creek that cut through the property, its gentle gurgle a stark contrast to the constant hum of urban life. The stars were out, bright and unyielding, and I was halfway through a thermos of coffee when the peace shattered. Flashlights sliced through the darkness, their beams harsh and disorienting. "Hands where we can see them. Step out of the tent now," a voice barked, authoritative and edged with impatience. My heart pounded as I unzipped the tent, squinting against the glare. 3 sheriff's deputies stood in a semicircle, their hands resting on holsters, faces stern under the brims of their hats. Behind them, a cluster of figures loomed, their silhouettes familiar yet menacing. At the center was Margaret Ellison, president of the Crestview Community Association (CCA). Her arms crossed, a triumphant smirk twisting her lips. She was in her late 50s, her blonde hair perfectly styled even at 10 a.m., her tailored blazer and pearl earrings screaming calculated authority. Flanking her were her loyal followers, Roger Klein, a retired banker with a perpetual scowl, Ellen Torres, a nervous-looking realtor who always seemed to be taking notes, and a few other CCA members I vaguely recognized from town meetings I'd avoided like the plague. "Mr. Whitaker," Deputy Ryan Holt said, his tone clipped but weary, "we've received a complaint about trespassing on restricted community land. You need to vacate the premises immediately." I blinked, my mind struggling to process the absurdity. "This is my land," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. "My great-uncle bought it in 1955. I have the deed, the surveys, everything. It's registered with the county." Margaret stepped forward, her smirk widening as she clutched a thick manila folder. "That's an interesting story, Mr. Whitaker, but according to our records, this meadow falls under CCA jurisdiction. It's been designated as a protected community green space. Your so-called deed is irrelevant." Her voice was smooth, almost rehearsed, and she pronounced my name with a deliberate twist. Whitaker instead of Whitaker, a petty jab. That made my jaw clench. I noticed Ellen Torres shifting uncomfortably, her eyes darting to the ground as if she didn't fully buy Margaret's story. Roger, on the other hand, puffed out his chest like a guard dog, glaring at me as if I'd personally insulted his honor. The deputies exchanged glances, and I caught a flicker of doubt in Holt's eyes. "Look, just sort it out with the CCA," he muttered, clearly eager to wrap this up and get back to his patrol car. "We're just following protocol." "Protocol," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "You're on my property, accusing me of trespassing, and you're telling me to sort it out. This is harassment." Margaret's eyes gleamed. "Harassment? Oh, Daniel, you're the one causing trouble. This meadow has been used for community events for years, shikes, picnics, even our annual Crestview Harvest Festival. We've invested thousands in maintaining it. You can't just waltz in and claim it as your own." I wanted to laugh at the audacity, but the sight of her folder stuffed with what I assumed were fabricated documents made my stomach churn. The other CCA members nodded in agreement, though Ellen's nod was half-hearted, her pen tapping nervously against her notebook. One of the deputies, a younger guy named Patel, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Just pack up for now, okay?" he said quietly. "We don't want this to escalate." Escalate. The word hung in the air like a threat. As I packed my tent under their watchful eyes, Margaret's smirk never wavered. She was enjoying this, reveling in the power she wielded. The deputy's flashlights followed my every move, and I caught Roger whispering something to Margaret, his eyes never leaving me. By the time I drove back to my cabina small, weathered structure Amos had built in the 1970s, my hands were shaking with rage. This wasn't just about a Meadow. This was about my family, my legacy, and someone trying to steal it right out from under me. Back at the cabin, I couldn't sleep. The injustice burned like a coal in my chest. I rummaged through the old oak chest where Amos had kept his records, pulling out yellowed folders and faded maps. There it was, the original deed from 1955, complete with the county's seal and Amos's meticulous handwriting noting every boundary marker. There was also a letter from the CCA, dated 7 years ago, shortly after Amos's death. It was a polite but firm request to donate the Meadow to the community for shared use. Amos had scrawled a single word across it in red ink: no. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office, armed with my documents. The clerk, a kind woman named Marjorie who'd known Amos, confirmed what I already knew. The Meadow was legally mine, free and clear. No HOA or community association can override a county-registered deed, she said, peering over her glasses. But be careful, Daniel. The CCA has been aggressive lately. They've been trying to claim easements on private properties all over Crestview. Her warning stuck with me as I drove back to the cabin. The CCA wasn't just a group of nosy neighbors, it was a machine. And Margaret Ellison was its engine. I started digging deeper, pulling up everything I could find on the CCA's activities. Their website boasted about community enhancements like the Harvest Festival, but the financials were vague, with no clear breakdown of where the money went. A few ex-posts from local residents hinted at discontent complaints about rising CCA dues, mysterious fines, and properties changing hands under pressure. One post, quickly deleted, mentioned Margaret's private fund for special projects. That evening, I got a text from an unknown number. Check your mailbox. You're not as clever as you think. Me. My pulse quickened as I walked to the rusty mailbox at the end of the driveway. Inside was a single sheet of papera notice from the CCA claiming I'd violated their green space ordinance by camping on protected land. The fine was $2,500, payable within 30 days, or they'd escalate to legal action. The audacity of it made my blood boil, but it also confirmed my suspicions. Margaret was playing dirty, and she wasn't alone. I decided to visit the Meadow again, this time during daylight. The scene was infuriating. A shiny new sign stood at the entrance, Crestview Community Meadow managed by CCA. The boundary markers, which I'd memorized from Amos's maps, had been moved at least 15 feet onto my land, creating the illusion that the Meadow was public property. I took photos, my hands trembling with anger, and noticed fresh tire tracks near the creek. Someone had been here recently, and it wasn't me. Back at the cabin, I called my old friend Jake Morales, a surveyor who'd worked with me on construction projects. Can you check some boundary markers for me? I asked. Something's off, and I need proof. Jake agreed to come out the next day, but his voice was cautious. I've heard about the CCA, Dan. They've got connections. Watch your back. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The cabin's windows rattled in the wind, and every creak of the floorboards set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, I heard a low rumble outside engines, multiple vehicles. I grabbed my flashlight and peered through the blinds. Two trucks were parked near the Meadow, their headlights off. Figures moved in the shadows, carrying what looked like metal posts. I wanted to confront them, but the memory of the deputy's flashlight stopped me. Instead, I recorded everything on my phone, zooming in as best I could. One figure turned, and even in the grainy footage, I recognized Margaret's distinctive silhouette, her blazer catching the moonlight. The next morning, Jake arrived with his equipment, his face grim as he surveyed the Meadow. These markers are new, he said, pointing to the freshly dug holes. Someone moved them within the last month. Your actual property line is 20 feet beyond where they've set these. This is deliberate, Dan. They're trying to shrink your land. He handed me a detailed report, complete with GPS coordinates and photos. It was the first piece of concrete evidence I had, but I knew it wouldn't be enough on its own. As Jake packed up, a CCA van pulled up, and out stepped Roger Klein, his face red with indignation. "What's this, Whitaker? Tampering with community property?" he barked, gesturing at Jake's equipment. "This is my land," I shot back, holding up the surveyor's report. "And these markers are on my property. Care to explain why they've been moved?" Roger's eyes narrowed, but he didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started typing furiously, no doubt reporting back to Margaret. "You'll hear from our lawyer," he said before storming off. That afternoon, I met with Sophia Nguyen, a 27-year-old freelance journalist who'd moved to Crestview a year ago. She'd been following the CCAS activities for a blog she ran, Crestview Uncovered, which had gained a small but loyal following. Over coffee at the town's only diner, she showed me screenshots of deleted CCA emails she'd managed to recover through a contact at the county. "They're charging fees for events at your Meadow," she said, her dark eyes intense. "Thousands of dollars, supposedly for maintenance, but there's no record of where it's going. And Margaret's been meeting with developers, big ones, from out of state." The pieces were starting to come together. This wasn't just about control, it was about money. Margaret was using the CCA to turn my family's Meadow into a cash cow, and I was the only thing standing in her way. Sophia agreed to help me dig deeper, promising to use her network to uncover more evidence. "But be careful," she warned. "Margaret's got eyes everywhere. I caught her checking my phone at a meeting once. She's paranoid." The pressure escalated over the next few days. My construction business started getting strange calls, clients questioning my reliability, citing community concerns. Someone spray-painted "selfish land hog" on my truck while I was at the hardware store. Neighbors I'd known for years stopped making eye contact at the gas station. It was psychological warfare, designed to wear me down. But every time I felt like giving up, I'd think of Amos, his weathered hands pointing to the stars, telling me to hold tight to what was ours. I spent my evenings poring over property law, learning about easements, adverse possession, and fraudulent claims. I found a 1970s county ordinance that protected private land from community overreach, a law Amos had helped draft after a neighbor lost their farm to a shady easement deal. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to confront Margaret at the next CCA meeting. The meeting was held in a stuffy community center, the walls lined with photos of Margaret shaking hands with local politicians. The room was packed, the air thick with tension. Margaret sat at the head of a long table, her folder open like a battle plan. Roger and Ellen flanked her, along with a few other board members who were matching CCA pins like medals. I walked in with my own folder, feeling like a gladiator entering the arena. "Mr. Whitaker," Margaret said, her voice dripping with condescension as she mispronounced my name again. What a surprise. Here to cause more trouble. I spread my documents on the table: Amos's deed, Jake's surveyor report, and the 1970s ordinance. "These prove the Meadow is mine," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Your markers are on my land, and your so-called community events are trespassing. I want answers." The room erupted in murmurs. Roger stood, his face beet red. "This is a members-only meeting, Whitaker. You're not welcome after your stunt at the Meadow." "Stunt?" I shot back. "You mean defending my family's legacy? You're the ones stealing land and profiting from it." Margaret's laugh was sharp, cutting through the noise. "Your old papers are meaningless, Daniel. The CCA has legal precedent through years of community use. Our lawyer has already reviewed this." She waved a document with a flourish, her eyes daring me to challenge her. That's when Sophia leaned over, her voice barely a whisper. "I've got footage from last night's meeting." Margaret slipped up, admitted the Meadow events were a revenue stream. "It's on my blog. Ready to go live." Her eyes sparkled with defiance, and I felt a surge of hope. This wasn't just my fight anymore. As the meeting descended into chaos, with residents shouting over each other, I noticed Ellen Torres slipping out the back. Her face was pale, her notebook clutched to her chest. Something told me she wasn't fully on Margaret's side. I made a mental note to reach out to her later. That night, I returned to the Meadow, determined to assert my rights. I set up my tent again, this time with Sophia and Jake as witnesses. Around 1 a.m., headlights swept across the field, and I braced myself for another confrontation. But it wasn't Margaret or the deputies. It was Ellen, her car parked haphazardly, her face streaked with tears. "I didn't sign up for this," she said, her voice trembling. "Margaret's been lying about everything. The Meadow, the funds, all of it. I found something in the CCA office files that show she's been skimming event money for years. She threatened to ruin me if I talked. She handed me a USB drive, her hands shaking. This has everything I could copy. Be careful, Daniel. She's not just ruthless as dangerous." As Ellen drove away, I felt the weight of the fight settling on my shoulders. The Meadow wasn't just land, it was a battleground, and Margaret Ellison was willing to do anything to win. But so was I. The USB drive Ellen Torres gave me felt like a live grenade in my hand. As I drove back to the cabin, the night pressed in around me, the stars obscured by clouds that mirrored the storm brewing in my chest. My great-uncle Amos's words echoed in my mind. "Hold tight to what's yours, Daniel. They'll try to take it, but you're a Whitaker. You don't bend." I wasn't bending, but I was starting to feel the strain. Margaret Ellison and her Crestview Community Association (CCA) weren't just trying to steal my Meadow, they were waging a war to break me. And they had the resources to make it hurt. Back at the cabin, I plugged the USB into my laptop, my hands still gritty from the Meadow's soil. Sophia Nguyen, the journalist who'd become my unexpected ally, sat across from me, her eyes sharp with anticipation. The files on the drive were a gold mine or a landmine, depending on how we played this. There were spreadsheets detailing community event revenue from my Meadow, with sums that didn't add up to the CCAS public financial reports. Emails between Margaret and an unknown contact referred to securing the Whitaker parcel. For a 7-figure opportunity, most damning was a memo from Margaret to the CCA board, dated 2 years ago, outlining a plan to reclassify private properties as community assets through strategic legal maneuvers. It was written in corporate jargon, but the intent was clear. She was orchestrating a land grab, and my Meadow was the crown jewel. "This is fraud," Sophia said, her voice low but fierce. "She's been using the CCA as a front to siphon money and pressure landowners into selling or surrendering. Look at this." She pointed to a folder labeled Crestview Acquisitions. It listed 3 other properties in Townsville Farms and wooded lots that had been acquired by the CCA after owners faced crippling fines or legal threats. One name stood out, the Henderson family, who'd left Crestview 5 years ago after losing their orchard to what they called unfair CCA violations. The pattern was chilling. "We need to be smart about this," I said, my mind racing. Margaret's got the sheriff's department in her pocket, at least partially, and she's got connections at the county level. If we go public too soon, she'll bury us in lawsuits or worse. Sophia nodded, already typing on her laptop. "I'll upload the files to a secure server and start cross-referencing names and dates. My blog's got enough followers to make some noise, but we need more evidence, something undeniable. And we need allies." The next morning, I called Jake Morales, the surveyor who'd confirmed the moved boundary markers. He agreed to meet me at the Meadow to double-check his findings and document everything with video. As we walked the property line, his GPS equipment beeping softly, he pointed out more signs of tampering. "These posts were dug up and reset at least twice," he said, kneeling by a marker half buried in the dirt. "See the soil disturbance? Someone's been sloppy. They didn't expect anyone to check this closely." As we worked, a familiar CCA van rolled up, and Roger Klein stepped out, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "Whitaker, you're trespassing again," he barked, holding up his phone like he was recording evidence. "And bringing your little surveyor friend doesn't change the facts. This is CCA land." I held up Jake's report, keeping my voice calm but firm. "This says otherwise, Roger. The Meadow's mine, and your markers are 20 feet inside my property line. Care to explain why you're stealing my land?" Roger's face turned purple, but before he could respond, another car pulled up, an old pickup truck driven by Walter Grayson, a grizzled 72-year-old who'd lived in Crestview his whole life. His property bordered mine to the west, and he'd known Amos better than anyone. He climbed out, leaning on a cane carved from cedar, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Thought I'd drop by," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "Heard you're stirring up trouble, Daniel. Good for you. Roger bristled. "This is CCA business, Grayson. Stay out of it." Walter chuckled, unfazed. "CCA business, huh? Funny, I remember when Amos and I fought the county over a similar land grab back in '78. They tried to call my creek a public easement. Didn't work out so well for them." He pulled a rolled-up map from his jacket, yellowed with age but meticulously drawn. "This here's from Amos's files. Shows your meadow clear as day, Daniel. And it matches the county records I checked this morning." Roger's eyes darted to the map, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stormed back to his van, slamming the door. As he drove off, Walter handed me the map. "Your uncle was a smart man," he said. "Kept duplicates of everything. Said the county folks like Margaret would come sniffing around eventually. Looks like he was right." That afternoon, Sophia called with news. She'd tracked down Ellen Torres, who was now openly questioning Margaret's leadership. "Ellen's scared," Sophia said over the phone. "She says Margaret's been threatening board members who asked too many questions, but she's willing to talk off the record, for now." She mentioned something about a special fund Margaret controls. Sound familiar? It did. The USB drive had referenced a community enhancement fund with no oversight, where thousands of dollars from Meadow events disappeared. I arranged to meet Ellen at a quiet park outside town, away from Margaret's prying eyes. When she arrived, she looked like she hadn't slept in days, her hands clutching a coffee cup like a lifeline. "I didn't know it would go this far," Ellen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret said the Meadow was abandoned, that you didn't care about it. She showed us document surveys, easements that looked real. But I started digging, and none of it adds up. She's been charging $500 a head for private events at your Meadow corporate retreats, weddings, you name it. The money's supposed to go to the CCA, but I've never seen a dime in our budget." She slid a folded piece of paper across the picnic table. It was a printout of a bank statement, showing transfers from the CCAS account to an offshore company called Crestview Ventures. "Margaret owns it," Ellen said. "I found the incorporation papers in her office. She's been funneling money for years." The revelation hit like a punch. Margaret wasn't just stealing my land. She was building a personal empire, laundering money through the CCA. But confronting her directly would be suicide. She had too much influence, too many allies. I needed to play her game, but smarter. The next few days were a blur of strategy and surveillance. Sophia's blog posts started gaining traction, with anonymous residents sharing stories of CCA overreach fines for minor violations, like unmowed lawns or unapproved paint colors, that forced families to sell. One post mentioned a widow who'd lost her home after the CCA claimed her backyard was a public pathway. The comments section exploded with outrage, and I noticed a few familiar names, including Clara Hayes, another CCA board member who'd seemed uneasy at the last meeting. But Margaret wasn't sitting idle. The harassment intensified. My construction business lost 2 major contracts after clients received anonymous letters questioning my legal troubles. My truck's windshield was smashed while parked at the cabin, and someone left a note, "Leave Crestview or lose everything." At the grocery store, the cashier, a kid I'd known since he was in diapers, whispered that Margaret had been asking about my purchases, looking for environmental violations. It was a psychological siege, designed to isolate and exhaust me. One night, I returned to the Meadow to check the boundary markers again. The CCA had escalated their claim, installing a chain-link fence around the creek, complete with signs reading "Private CCA property will be prosecuted." The audacity made my blood boil, but as I photographed the fence, headlights swept across the field. A black SUV pulled up, and out stepped Margaret, flanked by 2 men I didn't recognize, burly types in dark jackets, their eyes cold and professional. "Still causing trouble, Whitaker," Margaret said, her voice dripping with mockery. "This fence is just the beginning. By next month, this meadow will be a community park, and you'll be lucky if you're not in jail for trespassing." One of the men stepped forward, his hand resting on something under his jacket. "You should listen to her," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Accidents happen out here." I held my ground, my phone recording in my pocket. "This is my land, Margaret, and I've got proof you're stealing it. Keep pushing, and you'll be the one in jail." Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes flickered with something ganger, maybe fear. "You're out of your depth, Daniel," she said before turning back to the SUV. As they drove away, I noticed one of the men glance back, his expression unreadable. They weren't just CCA lackeys, they were hired muscle. The next morning, I met with Walter and Sophia at his farmhouse, a sprawling property cluttered with old farm equipment and stacks of legal books. Walter had a law degree from the 1970s, earned after serving in the Army, and he'd been quietly collecting dirt on the CCA for years. "Margaret's been at this a long time," he said, spreading out a folder of his own. "Back in '85, she tried to claim my creek for a public fishing access. Amos helped me fight her off. She was just a board member then, but she's been building her empire ever since." He showed me a letter from 1986, signed by Amos and Walter, establishing a mutual defense pact for their properties. "Your uncle knew the CCA would come for the Meadow eventually," Walter said. "He made me promise to back you up if it happened. And I've got something else." He pulled out a grainy photo of Margaret meeting with a man in a suit, taken at a diner 10 years ago. "That's Victor Slade, a developer who's been sniffing around Crestview for decades. He's got deep pockets and deeper corruption. Guess who's been funding Margaret's campaigns for CCA president?" The pieces were falling into place, but we needed something bigger, something that would expose Margaret publicly and dismantle her network. Sophia suggested a sting operation. We set up cameras at the Meadow, catch her or her goons doing something illegal. My blog's got enough reach to make it go viral. People are already angry about the CCAS fines and seizures. This could be the spark. We spent the next 2 days installing hidden cameras around the Meadow, camouflaged in trees and rocks. Walter knew a guy who sold hunting gear, and we got motion-activated cameras with night vision. As we worked, I noticed more signs of tampering freshly dug holes near the creek, as if someone was planning to divert the water. It was a bold move, one that could only mean Margaret was escalating her plans. That night, the cameras paid off. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed with an alert from the motion sensors. I pulled up the live feed and saw 3 figures in dark clothing, carrying shovels and what looked like industrial containers. They were pouring something into the creek, their movements quick and practiced. One figure turned, and the camera caught Margaret's face, her expression focused and cold. The containers had labeled chemicals, likely meant to contaminate the water and give her an excuse to declare the Meadow a public health hazard. I called Sophia and Walter, and we met at the cabin to review the footage. "This is it," Sophia said, her voice trembling with excitement. "She's poisoning your creek to frame you. We've got her on video, and I've already sent samples of the water to a lab for testing. If we can prove it's deliberate, she's done." But Margaret was one step ahead. The next morning, a county health inspector arrived at the Meadow, accompanied by a news crew from a local station. Margaret was there, playing the concerned community leader, her voice trembling with fake emotion as she pointed to the creek. "Daniel Whitaker has been dumping chemicals on this land, endangering our community's water supply," she said, tears welling for the cameras. "This meadow belongs to all of us, and he's trying to destroy it." The inspector, a nervous man named Gregson, took water samples while the news crew filmed. Residents gathered, some holding signs reading "Protect Our Meadow" and "Whitaker Out." I recognized a few face people I'd grown up with, now glaring at me like I was a criminal. The manipulation was masterful, and it was working. But I noticed something odd. Gregson kept glancing at Margaret, as if waiting for her approval. He wasn't just an inspector, he was in her pocket. Sophia was already uploading the camera footage to her blog, but we needed more time to get the lab results. In the meantime, Margaret's campaign intensified. My phone was flooded with anonymous texts, "Give up the Meadow or lose your business." My crew at the construction site reported vandalism, tools stolen, equipment damaged. My landlord in the city called, saying he'd received complaints about my unstable behavior and was considering terminating my lease. The breaking point came when I got a call from my sister, Emily, who lived 2 states away. "Someone called me, Dan," she said, her voice shaky. "They said you're involved in illegal dumping, that you're going to jail." Mom's freaking out. "What's going on?" I explained everything, trying to keep my voice steady for her sake. But inside, I was unraveling. Margaret wasn't just coming for my land. She was attacking my family, my livelihood, my reputation. I felt like I was drowning, but Amos's voice kept pulling me back. Don't bend, Daniel. Fight. The lab results came back 2 days later, and they were a game changer. The chemicals in the creek were industrial solvents, traceable to a company owned by Victor Slade. The developer Walter had mentioned. The batch numbers matched a shipment delivered to a warehouse Margaret had rented under Crestview Ventures. Sophia's contact at the lab confirmed the contamination was fresh less than 24 hours old. When the inspector arrived, it was deliberate, and we had the evidence to prove it. We decided to strike at the next CCA meeting, a public event billed as a community safety forum. The room was packed, the air electric with tension. Margaret stood at the podium, her folder open, delivering a speech about the threat to Crestview's natural beauty. She pointed to photos of the contaminated creek, blaming me for the damage. The crowd murmured in agreement, but I noticed Clara Hayes and a few others looking skeptical. I stood up, my heart pounding, and held up a USB drive of my own. I have evidence that proves Margaret Ellison is behind the contamination, I said, my voice carrying over the gasps. She's been poisoning my creek to frame me, stealing my land for profit, and using the CCA to launder money. The room erupted. Margaret's face went pale, but she recovered quickly, slamming her hand on the podium. This is slander. Mr. Whitaker is desperate, fabricating lies to avoid responsibility for his crimes. But Sophia was ready. She connected her laptop to the room's projector, and the video of Margaret pouring chemicals into the creek played on the screen. The crowd's murmurs turned to shouts of outrage. Clara Hayes stood, her voice trembling but clear. I've seen the financials, Margaret. Where's the money from the Meadow events? Why are there transfers to your personal company? Margaret's composure cracked, her eyes darting to the exit. But the residents were done with her lies. Roger Klein tried to defend her, but even he faltered as the evidence mounted. The meeting descended into chaos, with people demanding answers and calling for an investigation. Sophia live-streamed the entire thing, and within hours, her blog post went viral, with thousands of views and comments from across the country. As I left the meeting, Deputy Holt pulled me aside, his face grim. I didn't know it was this bad, he said quietly. Margaret's got dirt on half the department, including me. An old arrest from Kalagesh threatened to leak it unless I played along. But I'm done. I'll testify if you need me. His confession was a small victory, but it came with a warning. She's not going down without a fight, he said. And she's got friends in high places. Be careful. That night, I camped at the Meadow again, asserting my rights. Walter and Sophia joined me, their presence a reminder that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, we heard engines approaching. 3 trucks pulled up, and a crew began dismantling the CCAS fence, their faces nervous in the moonlight. One worker approached, his hands raised in surrender. We didn't know this was your land, he said. The lady said it was all legal. I've got kids to feed, man. I showed him Jake's surveyor report, and he nodded, backing away. We're done here, he said to his crew, and they packed up, leaving the fence half dismantled. As they drove off, I saw Margaret's SUV in the distance, her headlights cutting through the dark. She was watching, planning her next move. The war was far from over, but we'd drawn blood. Margaret's empire was cracking, and the truth was spreading. I stood by the creek, the water clear again under the stars, and felt Amos's presence. We're not done yet, I whispered, but we're fighting. The dawn broke over Whitaker's meadow with a golden glow, the creek sparkling as if it knew the fight for its freedom was nearing its end. I stood by the water's edge, the air crisp and heavy with the scent of wildflowers, my great-uncle Amos's old fishing hat resting on a nearby rock. The past weeks had been a crucible. Margaret Ellison and her Crestview Community Association CCA had pushed me to the brink, attacking my land, my livelihood, and my family's legacy. But the evidence we'd gather at the USB drive from Ellen Torres, the video of Margaret poisoning the creek, the surveyor's report from Jake Morales, and the old maps from Walter Grayson had given us a fighting chance. Sophia Nguyen's blog, Crestview Uncovered, had turned our private war into a public reckoning, with thousands following the story online. Yet I knew Margaret wasn't finished. She was a predator, cornered but dangerous, and the final battle was looming. The county courthouse loomed over Crestview like a stone giant, its steps crowded with residents as I arrived for the emergency hearing. The agenda was clear, addressing the Whitaker Meadow dispute and the CCAS claim to my land. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the wooden benches packed with locals, some clutching signs reading "Save Our Meadow," others whispering about the viral videos exposing Margaret's corruption. Sophia was there, her laptop open, live streaming to her growing audience. Walter sat beside me, his cane tapping rhythmically, a banker's box of documents at his feet. Ellen Torres and Clara Hayes, the CCA board members who'd turned against Margaret, flanked us, their faces pale but resolute. Margaret sat at the front, her tailored blazer impeccable, her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun. She was flanked by a high-priced lawyer from the city, a man named Charles Brandt, whose shark-like smile suggested he thrived on cases like this. Her folder, ever present, lay open on the table, but her usual smirk was gone, replaced by a steely determination. She knew this was her last stand, and she'd come prepared. The hearing began with Brandt presenting the CCAS case, his voice smooth as polished marble. He displayed aerial photos of the Meadow, claiming years of community use established legal precedent. He produced a forged survey, dated 1980, that falsely placed the Meadow under CCA jurisdiction. Mr. Whitaker's claims are based on outdated documents, Brandt said, gesturing dismissively at my folder. He's an absentee landowner seeking to disrupt Crestview's harmony for personal gain. The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others exchanging skeptical glances. Margaret's performance was flawless, dabbed her eyes with a tissue, playing the victim for the cameras stationed at the back. But I noticed the county assessor, a nervous man named Peterson, avoiding eye contact. He'd been one of Margaret's allies, and his presence on the panel made my stomach churn. When it was my turn, I stood, my hands steady despite the adrenaline. "This isn't about harmony," I said, my voice carrying to the back of the room. "It's about theft. Margaret Ellison has been using the CCA to steal private land, including mine, for profit. She's poisoned my creek, moved boundary markers, and pocketed thousands from events held on my property without permission." I laid out the evidence methodically. Amos's 1955 deed, Jake's surveyor report showing the tampered markers, the USB drive's financial records exposing Margaret's offshore company, Crestview Ventures. When I played Sophia's video of Margaret dumping chemicals into the creek, the room erupted. Residents shouted, some demanding Margaret's arrest, others calling me a liar. Brandt tried to object, but the judge, a stern woman named Alvarez, silenced him with a raised hand. "These are serious allegations, Mr. Whitaker," she said, her eyes sharp. "Do you have corroborating evidence?" Before I could answer, Walter stood, his voice booming despite his age. "Your Honor, I've got something better." He opened his banker's box and pulled out a document that made my heart skip. It was a conservation easement, signed in 1973 by Amos and other landowners, including Walter's father. "This protects Whitaker's Meadow in perpetuity," Walter said, handing it to the bailiff. "No HOA, county, or developer can touch it without unanimous consent from the original signatories or their heirs. It's federal law, and it's ironclad." The courtroom buzzed as Judge Alvarez reviewed the easement, her brow furrowing. Brent's composure faltered, his eyes darting to Margaret, who sat frozen, her hands gripping her folder like a lifeline. Sophia leaned over, whispering, "That's the nuclear option Walter mentioned." Margaret didn't see this coming. Clara Hayes stood next, her voice trembling but clear. "I was on the CCA board, and I saw Margaret manipulate documents and pressure residents. She threatened me when I questioned her finances. The Meadow events generated over $50,000 last year, but none of it appeared in our public budget." She held up a flash drive of her own. "This is bank records showing transfers to Crestview Ventures, Margaret's company." Ellen Torres followed, her testimony quieter but no less devastating. "I found emails between Margaret and Victor Slade, a developer. They planned to turn the Meadow into a luxury retreat, splitting millions. She framed Daniel to discredit him and seize the land. The crowd's anger was palpable now, a low roar that made Brant shift uncomfortably. Margaret's face was a mask of fury, but she didn't speak. Instead, Brant tried to pivot, claiming the easement was outdated and the financial records were misinterpreted. But the cracks in Margaret's empire were widening. Then came the unexpected blow. A man in a rumpled suit stood from the back of the room, his face haggard but determined. "I'm Harold Vance," he said, and the room fell silent. Vance was the former CCA treasurer Margaret had claimed ran off with stolen funds 5 years ago. "I didn't disappear because I stole anything. Margaret framed me when I found her embezzling. I've been working with federal investigators ever since." He produced a thick binder, handing it to the bailiff. "These are records of Margaret's transactions, forged documents, bribes to county officials, and plans to seize protected lands across Crestview. Whitaker's Meadow was her biggest target, but it wasn't the only one." The courtroom exploded. Residents surged to their feet, shouting accusations at Margaret. Judge Alvarez banged her gavel, calling for order, but the tide had turned. Margaret's lawyer whispered urgently in her ear, but she pushed him away, standing to speak. "This is a conspiracy," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Whitaker, Vance, all of you're jealous of my leadership. I've built this community, and you're tearing it down." Her outburst was a desperate final act, and it backfired spectacularly. Peterson, the county assessor, stood, his face ashen. "I was pressured by Margaret to falsify records," he said, his voice barely audible. "She promised me a cut of the Meadow deal. I'm sorry." Judge Alvarez's ruling was swift. "The conservation easement is legally binding," she declared. "Whitaker's Meadow is protected, and any attempt to violate it is a federal offense. As for the allegations against Ms. Ellison, I'm referring this case to the district attorney for a criminal investigation." As deputies escorted Margaret from the courtroom, her eyes locked on mine, burning with hatred. "This isn't over, Whitaker," she hissed as she passed. I didn't flinch. Her empire was crumbling, and she knew it. The fallout was immediate. Sophia's live stream of the hearing went viral, with over 100,000 views by nightfall. Comments poured in from across the country, people sharing their own stories of HOA corruption. The district attorney opened a formal investigation into Margaret, Victor Slade, and several county officials. Peterson resigned that afternoon, and Deputy Holt, freed from Margaret's blackmail, agreed to testify about her influence over the sheriff's department. The victory celebration at the Meadow that weekend was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Residents brought food, music, and folding chairs, turning the field into a festival of defiance. Kids ran through the grass, splashing in the creek that was clean again after the county's emergency cleanup. Walter held court by the fire, telling stories of Amos's battles against land grabbers in the 70s. Clara and Ellen, now heroes in their own right, apologized to the crowd for their role in the CCAS schemes. "We didn't know how deep it went," Clara said, her voice choked with emotion. "But we're here now, and we're with you." Sophia set up a webcam at the creek, streaming live footage to her blog as a permanent reminder of our fight. The viewer count stayed high, with people tuning in to see the Meadow's peaceful beauty, a symbol of what we'd saved. As the sun set, I stood on the same spot where Amos had taught me to fish, the water reflecting the orange sky. "We did it," I said to Sophia, who stood beside me, her camera still rolling. "Your uncle would be proud," she replied, her smile tired but genuine. "But we need to stay vigilant. Margaret's got friends, and they won't let this go quietly." She was right. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from a law firm representing Victor Slade. It was a thinly veiled threat, citing irregularities in the conservation easement and hinting at a federal lawsuit. I laughed, a real laugh, for the first time in months. The easement was ironclad, and Slade's legal posturing was just noise. But it was a reminder that the fight wasn't truly over. Sophia turned our story into a documentary, The Meadow Rebellion, which drew interest from streaming platforms. We insisted that any profits go to a legal fund for others battling HOA corruption. The film's final shot was me standing on the creek bank at sunset, casting a line into the water, the meadow alive with wildflowers. Walter's laughter echoed in the background, and Sophia's narration spoke of a community reborn. But the real ending was quieter. One evening, as I sat by the creek, a family of deer emerged from the woods, their silhouettes graceful against the fading light. They were the same kind Amos had loved to watch, their presence a reminder of why we'd fought. My phone buzzed with a final message from an unknown number. "You won this round, Whitaker. Enjoy it while it lasts." I deleted it without a second thought. Margaret was serving a 20-year sentence for fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. Her empire reduced to a cell. The CCA was dissolved, its assets returned to the residents she'd swindled. Crestview was healing, but the scars would linger. As I packed up my fishing gear, I thought of Amos, his voice steady in my memory. "Hold tight. Daniel, I had, and I would again if I had to. The Meadow was ours forever.